Yeah, this is the beginning. So welcome back to episode 11 of 11 Named People. Is that? I think in some places they call that your crown birthday or something. I don't know. So this is the show that's named after something that the historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote down at some point, where he said that the imagined community of millions seem more real as a team of 11 named people. And we are going to ask our guest today about that. But yeah, the show is presented by myself, Sean Jacobs, and also by my good friend Tony Karen. I don't think we planned it this way, but we're both from Cape Town, and we are both Liverpool supporters. But in any case, welcome back.
So,
Tony.
talking about being Liverpool supporters, I have to tell you this, right? Match day finds me on the couch with my phone, right? And there are two conversations going on. In WhatsApp, I'm talking to Sean and sometimes his father as well when we do a live call in Cape Town. And in whatever Messenger, I'm talking to Michael. Right? This is my match day experience right here on the screen. And I mean, I see. I think if you printed out Michael and my conversations in the course of a year, like how many of when Klopp more often than not does the tactical switch that with the substitutions that we anticipate by about 5 or 10 minutes or advocate for, and when he doesn't, then doesn't really. It often doesn't work out very well. So, like Michael is a future manager of Liverpool FC. That's when after Xabi Alonso, by the way, because people talk rubbish about Steven Gerrard, he'll never be ready to manage us, but Xabi might well be. But I'll leave that aside for a minute. But very excited to have Michael on the show. I've known Michael for many years, originally as a Middle East analyst when I used to write for Time Magazine about the Middle East, and then we kept running into each other in all sorts of places, either like buying fancy clothes or but then football became like, yes, okay, there's all these other points of connection. We see the Middle East in a similar way. We definitely see football in the same way. And Michael today, I mean, he's worked many places as a writer and analyst on Middle East dynamics and also US political dynamics. Today he's with the International Crisis Group, esteemed organization at which many of my favorite people have often worked. And maybe it's opposite because crisis is a good word associated with Liverpool. But I want to kick this off, I think, with Michael's backstory because it's so interesting. Michael comes from an Egyptian family and he grew up in Greater Liverpool, I guess we can call it, in the 1970s, at which point he adopts the shared identity that we all have of the red. So, we want to talk about, I mean, among the things we want to talk about today is, that background, Liverpool in the 1970s, what it was like to be an immigrant Liverpool fan in the 1970s. We want to talk about Mo Salah today, the pressures that face somebody has that kind of status in Egyptian football, when he's playing for the national team. Nobody can get inside the head of Mohamed Salah, but, some context and perspective on what he faces back home, etc. And then, of course, the crisis. What's happening with Liverpool right now and how we're going to play our way out of it. But starting off, Michael, tell us about how you first come to wear the red shirt.
Yeah, well, it's nice to be with you both. I've watched the show in the past, and yes, I mean, maybe for efficiency's sake, we should just fuse the conversations. Then you wouldn't have to repeat yourself. But yes, the match day experience is always accompanied with furious texting with Tony. So Liverpool. So my parents finished medical school in Cairo in 1970, and they leave. They go to England. And they end up in Merseyside doing their residencies. And I'm born a few years later. And of course, this is the beginning, sort of the middle of the kind of heyday. And of course, my father is a Liverpool fan. And I'm a young kid at this point, obviously, but, by osmosis, you just pick up these things. Luckily, red, not blue, a good choice from an early stage. I don't know if it was much of a choice, but in any event, I was around as a little kid when in '77, first European Cup, and those things make a big impression. I remember those. Those are some of my earliest memories in life.
Who's the player that you first sort of identify with, that you kind of go like, that's
yeah. I mean, I would say at a point when I really, really got it. I mean, Kenny, obviously, I paid attention to and knew, but I think the first person that I sort of as someone who kind of begins to understand the game a little bit is probably John Barnes. The one that first sort of captivates the imagination in a way that's different than just sort of watching so probably John Barnes. So the rest of the story is that Liverpool in the 1970s, it's not a great time for Liverpool. It's the beginning of a difficult time.
You mean for the city or for the club?
For the city. My father actually liked Merseyside quite a bit, would have stayed. My mother, not so much. And so we end up leaving Liverpool and coming to the US. There's a lot to be said about English society in the late 70s. I think social dynamics are with respect to immigrants and immigration, they're demonstrably different in the United States. And I think my mother in particularly felt that very keenly, and I think was very, adamant about not wanting to stay in England. And so we came to the US. The thing that I did not give up when we came was my love of LFC, and that has stayed with me. I think part of that too is that I played football my whole life. I spent a lot of my summers in Egypt, and so this was just a fixed part of my sense of the world and self.
So just a question, how did you manage to actually stay in touch with the game in the United States? Because it wasn't on TV anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so it was difficult. I would read about it. That was part of it. I tried to follow as much as possible World Cups and Paninis, and most World Cups in those days. I was in Egypt in the summertime often. I remember watching the '82 final from the Officers Club in Marsa Matruh with my grandfather, Paolo Rossi. Until communication becomes much easier. It's a difficult thing to do as a kid and from a distance.
I was going to say, because the same South Africa, it was only like late 80s really that there would be one game on TV on a Sunday. Often it was us because we were so good back then. You remember the Liverpool fanzine was called When Sunday Comes, because but I mean, when I started out, it was like BBC World Service and Shoot Magazine and the daily papers. Like you would kind of, it was an article of faith. You weren't seeing what you were hearing, but you were believing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even when I moved to New York City in 1996, and obviously there were, it was still a kind of not seamless experience. You had to go to on an early Saturday morning. You had to go to Nevada Smith's or some place to watch football. It wasn't accessible, but I mean, that was just part of it.
The Setanta years.
That's also 1996 is also kind of the beginning of the MLS, right? So it is the moment at which there's probably more interest in football in the US. Not like it was later, as you said, with easier communication, but it is sort of the beginnings. of
Yeah.
football is on your TV more than it was before. Because I remember I came to the US in '95. I do remember you didn't see much football. I later would see like highlight packages from Rai of like Serie A, but you barely saw like football on your television. Like
Yeah, I confess, I switched off. Like I missed the whole Spice Boys era because I was here, and it's just like it wasn't part of your visual or any reality really. I was like, it was only almost when Fox Soccer Channel started that I actually resumed. And I remember the thing that struck me most when that happened was there was this guy at Chelsea called Frank Lampard, and I'm like, no, he can't still be playing. He must be about 60 years old now. Anyway.
So do you have just to go back to that sort of brief? So you have this brief period in the UK or England. Do you have any affinity then, or do you identify with the English national team, or do you have like a little spot for them? Do you watch them? Have you followed their change in what the English team represents, who plays for them? Are you excited by it? Like, how do you relate to that?
I mean, I definitely, I follow 3 national teams effectively. I follow the US team, I follow the Egyptian team, and just by dint of all of these other factors, I end up knowing a lot and about the English national team always. Liverpool's relationship to the national team is a complicated one. In any event, setting that all aside, I pay attention. I'm paying attention particularly to the Liverpool players. We hear about national team selection constantly. Obviously, I paid a lot of attention when Stevie was on the national team and trying to fit that midfield in that never worked, and of course Michael Owen. So of course, particularly because of of the role that Liverpool players have played, I end up paying attention, no doubt.
This is actually a bit of a going down a side rabbit hole for a second, but I think because Sean's asking you about like the English game, so I know your son Tamer is actually an excellent footballer at like elite youth football level in the United States, and I'm sort of wondering any insights about the influence of English football on the way football is played in the US at a youth level, and maybe something about how the US suffers as a result.
Well, I mean, I guess, Tamer is playing in, within the league. It's MLS Next. These are the academies. He's, he's 13 years old. He's an 8th grader. He's the captain of his academy team. He plays soccer a lot. My girls are also very serious soccer players as well. And, I think the difference. So what I would say is that as opposed to when I was growing up, they're much more technically proficient, and I think they're more tactically aware because they play more and they watch more, and I think that's quite different. I think obviously the academy system in the US has a long way to go, but it's just not comparable to when I was a kid in high school playing soccer. It's radically different. And there's massive improvement. There's a lot of room for growth, but it's unrecognizable from what when the kind of the setting that I experienced growing up.
And does football? I mean, when it comes to our, look, most of our experience of football is sitting on a couch watching television, but it means so much to us, right? That is a devotional experience, shall we say? Does it mean the same to him, to your son? Like the next generation who are growing up in America with saturation coverage of English and European football. Does it mean, do you see the connection in the same way, that kind of passion and the identifying with, particular teams and traditions, or is it different somehow?
I know that it's different. I think thankfully, I don't know if I forced them, but there's been no discussion about, affinities. So they're all on the easy, again, right? It's, and the difference now is that lots of people know about about football and football players, and lots of people play fantasy. I mean, the kind of accessibility of the game is just so much different. And you get out of bed early on a Saturday morning, you turn on the television, and it's there. The Champions League's there, and so it's the experience is very different, and the accessibility is very different, and the ubiquity of the game is just it's quite distinct from what.
I totally agree with you. I have a 12-year-old who has also gone to Anfield, plays football for like a local club. He doesn't watch as much football as I would watch. I think he has a different experience to it. Like, he doesn't like to see Liverpool lose. So the tension of losing, he doesn't like to see. He can play football with all the passion. He loves playing it, but watching it, he has a totally different relationship to it. And then occasionally I'll catch him on his own watching the Liverpool highlights, either via like TikTok or something. So he's not even watching it in these spaces where we're watching it. He's sort of like, it's a completely different experience, and it's not even saturated coverage. But there's definitely a similar passion, but he doesn't share this kind of like, my kind of checking news, getting my weekly fiver, whatever, from the Guardian.
I mean, he switches off. They switch off during the transfer window, and we don't.
They don't care about that. Yeah.
But, so talking about the meaning of football to like a city, you were referencing, what was happening in Liverpool in the era when Thatcher takes power, and all of the social impact that has. I mean, do you have any memories of that? Just the sense of what it felt like in the city when Liverpool was one thing that was going right for the city. Well, probably Everton was as well to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, Everton was as well. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I was young, and so dock workers and dock worker strikes, those kinds of things didn't mean anything to me. They're obviously infused in the kind of identity of the city and the experience of the city. What the kind of a city in transition really, and what Thatcherism did to the North, not just Liverpool, but Liverpool in particular. That most of that I see in hindsight. I was probably too young to understand what the city was going through. It's clearly part of, I think it infused the kind of dynamics and the atmosphere at the time. And Liverpool was not. For a family coming from Egypt, just the weather alone is daunting.
I was going to ask also about the food, because that would also point us to what Mohamed Salah's experience is. It's like, can you find melochia anywhere in?
It's totally different now. I mean, it's just not. It's not. I like going back to Liverpool. I try to go back. Maybe try to go once, twice a year to go. It's just. It's the late 70s are a long time ago. But I think there are a few clubs that sort of embody the kind of the city, the history of the city, as much as Liverpool does. And I don't think that's just me being romantic about my football club. I think it's true, but I'm also being romantic about my football club. Yes,
and it doesn't. And you don't think it changed, like whether Liverpool was winning or losing, that connection, right?
Well, I mean, it's easier when you're winning. That's for sure. I think. I mean, it was. There have been tough. There's been some difficult times. I think. There have been moments, even in the difficult times. There have been moments of, 2005 came at a time when things weren't going great, and there's never been there have been like the Jitsu, the Gillette, the Hicks Gillette era was a dark one, and that I don't, if that had gone on much longer, we might be having a different conversation, because I think the club might have been on the brink of insolvency in a way that might not have been recoverable. But yeah, it's nice that we've been successful of late. That's for sure. I'll say that.
So talking about Egypt and Mo Salah. Mo Salah plays a very different game for us as he plays for Egypt, obviously. But one gets the sense that I don't know, or does one, that his morale and his mental well-being is far more profoundly affected by what's happening with the national team and probably what's happening with the nation itself, than is obvious to like fans who sort of simply, watching week in, week out what's happening with Liverpool. Like, can you offer any thoughts or insights into that? I mean, we've seen things like, when he goes with Egypt to the World Cup and he's suddenly being paraded around with, I think it was Ramzan Khadira. Right? Like, how is that? That tells you so much about, well, possibly.
Or he goes to Egypt and Sisi kind of makes him stand next to him to launch something like hotel or resort or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible amount of pressure. I think he's the first Egyptian player to fill this kind of global role. There have been great Egyptian players, but I mean, nobody has filled this and played at this level for this long and had this kind of stature in the international game. I'm a Zamalek fan in Egypt, and at the time when I would go to lots of games in the 90s with my uncle and my cousin, most Egyptian players stayed home. There were very few Egyptian players that went abroad. Magdi Abdelghani was one of the first. He went to Portugal. Hani Ramzi went after the 1990 World Cup. He went to Germany, and interestingly enough, he's Coptic. He's one of the very, very, very small number of Christians playing professional soccer. But all that being said, most Egyptian players stayed home for a very long time, and the quality of the Egyptian league was pretty good. I think that's been reflected over the years in Egypt's performance in the African Cup of Nations. They've had great success there.
By the way, we're both Orlando Pirates as well.
Although I do like Al Ahly with Pitso, but that's we want to ask you about that at some point.
Yeah, but carry on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but so there begins there. Hani Ramzi is really kind of one of the very first ones in the early 90s. It takes time. Egyptian players are now that pathway to Europe is much more well trod. But Salah, it represents something quite different in his level of focus, his professionalism, his discipline, and then his success, right? I mean, he's just a brilliant player and has been doing this year on year. And it's just something that Egypt and the Arab world have not seen before. Nobody really comes close. And even in comparison continentally, in terms of African greats, he will go down in the end as one of a handful of the very best. And with that, obviously, comes adulation, but pressure. And I think one of the big differences in this era is that the Egyptian national team is not particularly strong. And so, it creates these unrealistic expectations of him. I think the kind of successive setbacks, both against Senegal last year in the World Cup qualifying and then in the final of the African Cup of Nations, I think mentally probably did take I think physically on one end, but obviously also mentally took a toll on Salah. I think particularly because past teams and less talented players, frankly, have had success, particularly at the African Cup of Nations. Egypt has been slightly jinxed in terms of World Cup qualifying in all sorts of strange ways. But I think those pressures and the kind of mixed record at the national level clearly have taken a toll on him. I don't think you have to do any kind of deep psychoanalysis to figure that out. There's the Egyptian national team is not going to do great things anytime soon, and then that's the reality.
I just have a sort of related question. I remember there was some journalism, maybe 2 years, about 2 years ago, where people said that he was also in in a kind of unenviable position politically, in which various kind of different political constituencies wanted to claim him, and that he also like had to deal with that, like the brother, like what is the player who lives in Qatar now, who openly said Abu Trika, who was sort of associated with the Brotherhood, right? And the government saw him as
an MP. He was one of their parliamentary candidates,
right? Whereas, and then so you have Salah, who is, because of that, what you just described is this kind of outsized. He's like, it's crazy levels that he's achieving as a player. So everybody would like to claim him, and there was an argument that part of his reluctance to say anything about anything was about that balance. Like some people were like, why don't you say anything? But the other was like, he was just left in a place where he couldn't say, he can't like make political pronouncements.
Yeah, no, it's a very difficult balancing act. Tony referenced what happened in Russia in the World Cup, which I think was deeply uncomfortable for him. I think, he has expressed multiple times his admiration for Abu Trika, setting aside the kind of political sensitivities. I think he, it is a difficult balancing act. My sense of him is that he's not a particularly political person, but he, I think, is cognizant of these pressures and is really focused on playing and on football, and I think doesn't. I think the pressure on him is such that I think he's not interested in creating bigger kinds of distractions for himself and his family. I think he gets all sorts of crazy pressures on religious grounds. He puts up a Christmas tree, a kind of festive, seasonal, secular Christmas tree in his living room. And the Islamists go crazy, and he gets all kinds of really heated criticism on religious grounds. There are quite a few others who think he's immodest with all his prancing around with his shirt off. So he gets criticism for that. I think it's a tough task. I think he does an okay job of navigating all that. But I do think it probably does take a toll, and I think people probably don't quite grasp at times the kinds of cross-cutting pressures that he faces.
And in some ways, you could say that there's something of a tradition around that with some footballing greats. I mean, the Pelé analogy seems quite apt because it's a dictatorship, and he was in a dictatorship and very quietist in a way. And I mean, as much as Sean and I would also agree, our favorite ever footballer, citizen is Socrates. Socrates was an exception. And you look at Brazil's footballers today, you wish they would shut the fuck up. To be honest. Politics are appalling.
To a player in this election, I think we were just joking about this the other day, except for Richarlison Tottenham, which is where people hate this guy, and here's the one guy who's got decent politics, and everybody else is essentially a Bolsonaro supporter. So,
but even beyond that, like, okay, he wasn't in a dictatorship, but I think in some ways you see something a little similar with Zidane, where Zidane very consciously is very furiously resisting efforts to cast him as the great unifier and the Black Blanc Bird thing. He's also resisting efforts to claim him as Arab because he's actually Amazigh, and he's saying, no, I'm a Kabyle. And even, Islam, he's like, well, I'm a non-practicing Muslim. I mean, that seems like a heavily coded statement. So it's like he's almost defined, like, don't make me part of your narratives. I'm just here to play football. The reason I headbutted Materazzi had nothing to do with any grand Fanon-esque narratives, as much as some of us would have liked to assume that. But
people writing poems about it, and like,
it's a great poem, the Claudia Rankine poem.
Salah has never said he's never made those kind of Zidane-like statements, though, right? He's never said.
No, I mean, he doesn't. I mean, he wants to be the kind of genial face of football, the ambassador for the game. He does a lot of outreach. He's a good citizen. He's philanthropic. He's charitable, but has never made a show of kind of rebelling against those who want to force him into their cause. He just goes about his business, frankly.
Mhm.
And putting aside the national team and Salah for a minute, like any insights on the Sisi regime's relationship with football, given the role of the Zamalek and Ahly supporters in the 2011 rebellion, given the Port Said revenge that the regime took, like where are things at now in terms of football being both potentially something that's a great tool for a dictatorship to deflect and neutralize any energies that might cut against them, but on the other hand, representing this danger of actually creating an organized mass of people who could turn against you? Like, what's the read right now?
Yeah, I mean, there was great paranoia around the ultras for many years, and after the Port Said disaster, there weren't football fans in stadium in Egypt for quite a number of years. It took a long time for things to effectively normalize. I think Egyptian society is not at the moment sort of ripe for uprising revolution. It is, it's always hard it's very difficult to be predictive about mass mobilization and why protests gain traction. But 2011 and its aftermath took a toll on Egypt and the region, but has had, I think, profound psychological effects. Obviously, the regime is quite cognizant of opposition and dissent, and is very quick to snuff those out, and has done quite a efficient job at that. It's football now goes on in a kind of more normal way. But we don't see the kinds of manifestations of political sensibilities on the part of ultras. 2011 was a long time ago in some sense now, it's Egypt is dealing with price shocks and commodity shocks, I think those difficulties, coupled with I think profound fears within society about what instability would mean, make it make this not a kind of ripe situation for political dissent, fomentation, really active opposition politics. There's no real space for that now at the moment, and so. You don't have the same kind of approach to football and the kind of really very serious paranoia and suspicion that we saw in 2011, 12, 13, even 2014. It's not.
No, I was going to say. I think I was listening to a seminar recently by a sociologist from Germany, who did a study about how the football authorities in Egypt is also trying to create a different kind of spectator. So to make football more kind of, to depoliticize football by making it more like about families. Of course, there's also like that they at some point, they only allowed fans if Egyptian teams were playing in the African Champions League, or if the national team was playing, but not allowing them during club games. So there's like it's like you said, it's a very good way of controlling and managing the process to like sideline sort of the political potential of ultras. Yeah.
So I just want one footnote. I'm just worried that, with like 15, 20 minutes left, we have to talk about where Liverpool is right now. But before that, just one thing. We are, both South African, and we lament the failure, the refusal of most African national teams to actually have an African coach, right? That Aliou Cissé in some ways is an exception. So, we find it completely charmingly surprising that Pitso Mosimane, who can't get the job to manage the national team in South Africa, is managing Egypt's premier club. Sorry, I mean, I know.
What he says.
But what, how does that play in Egypt? Like, is an African coach?
He's the
Egypt,
first. He was the first coach from a sub-Saharan country, right? To coach one of the top teams, right?
Yeah, no, I was very surprised at the selection. He did pretty well. Unfortunately, from my perspective, in one sense, although Zamalek is now, doing okay at the moment. I mean, look, there's real discrimination against in Egypt, and there is. So I was surprised at the selection. He faced some intense skepticism and did a pretty good job with Ahly. That is not an enviable position to be in. Egyptian African relations are complicated. That's maybe a diplomatic way of saying it, but where Egypt fits in the continent is a complicated question going in both directions. So yes, I was surprised at the selection. I was glad in one sense, from a kind of neutral observer perspective, that he did have some success, particularly in the Champions League, yeah, I mean, the Egyptian national team has cycled through a host of foreign coaches. In the 90s, they did have some Egyptian managers, and frankly played better at the time. But I think,
was it Alga? What's his name again? I know what you're talking about. He's a former player.
Yeah, what's his name?
He won he won most of those cups that Egypt.
Yeah,
in charge. Yeah, is it Hossam? Al Gadari? Maybe I'm wrong now.
No, I'm forgetting.
Anyway, yeah, I'll remember. I used to love that coach with the big mustache, right?
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I used to watch this guy. I know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so onto the pain points of the moment. You're sitting on the couch with Tamer. He's like, "Why are we conceding so many goals? Like, and why aren't we in contention? Why are Arsenal and Manchester City so far away from us? What's going on, and how are we going to fix this? What's your patient answer?"
Yes, Hassan Shahatov. Yeah, that's
it just came to my head.
Yeah, it's so it's been a strange start. It's October, very early October. I take some solace there, and I assume, because it's Jurgen Klopp and it's this edition of Liverpool, that it will be fixed eventually. But I guess it has been a bit of a shock. And I was at the Champions League final in Paris last year, and thinking where the club was not that many months ago to now, even thinking about what the club looked like during the Community Shield, and yes, it's effectively a friendly, it's not a real game, I get all that, but still there was a level of cohesion and proficiency in the play, and where we find ourselves at the moment, it's strange, and I think the thing that I find most surprising, two things I would say. One is the number of just absolute core players. Many of them I would class as world-class players. People like Trent, people like Virgil, people like Mo, people like Fabinho, who are all out of form effectively at the same time. That's strange. And then the lack of intensity I find really puzzling. It's as if there is a kind of collective hangover from going to the maximum, playing the maximum number of games possible in every competition, having great success, coming up a little bit short. But it seems, I don't know if there is something to that, if there is just some kind of holdover effect from last year and exerting so much physical, mental effort across the board. But it is weird. I would have never have suspected it. And I assume it's every little instance here we see like the Bournemouth game, we see the Ajax game where I think, okay, like things are getting better. And I do think the game against Rangers was a step in the right direction. I've been saying for weeks now that we need to play 4-2-3-1 or 4-4-2.
Yeah, that's one of our Twitter. I mean, one of our tech conversations is always basically take off a midfielder, bring Firmino back into the midfield, and play the other three. Let him play behind the other three. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I mean the middle of the field has just been wide open. So just in terms of tactics, I don't know why. I think part of it is there is some mysterious situation happening with Fabinho, and he is a guy that just really protected the back four and cleaned up and was always there. And a little drop in his performance is having a big impact. And I'm not sure. I have no explanation for that, frankly. It's mysterious. I do think putting another presser on in the form of an attacker, I think pressing from the front will probably help. I think we're really missing Naby Keita. I think he's our best midfield presser. I think our best midfield is Fabinho when he's playing like he can with Thiago and Naby Keita. I mean, I think last year we saw that in the FA Cup semifinal. They played together and they were absolutely on it, and they were really brilliant. And I know people have mixed views of Keita.
We don't see enough of him to form a
Yeah, to make an
well,
opinion.
yeah, I know. But there are times when he plays and he plays brilliantly, I think, and he still comes in to be slated. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of unfortunate, rash of injuries that have really impacted the team. I think Konate being out actually really does impact Trent because, I love Joel, and I think he's a brilliant center back.
He's our player of the season right now.
Yeah, but I mean, I think
Those weird loopy runs that he makes.
they're great.
Alan Hansen run.
Yeah, but Konate does bring something different in his ability to recover and his pace. I think does provide a little bit extra protection to Trent, particularly in this kind of frail midfield situation. But I mean, I think the thing that I find puzzling is the seeming lack of intensity out there, and that's never of all the things you could critique a Klopp-coached Liverpool team, that's never been one. They've always been intense.
And so, I mean, it does look to us from a distance, like particularly with the players that you mentioned. I mean, particularly Virgil and Mo, and I guess Fabinho, like Trent. Klopp makes valid excuses, I think, for Trent in terms of Trent's going to be exposed if the midfield's not functioning or if the press isn't functioning. So it's about where Klopp is telling Trent to play, not about the way. If you restrict Trent to a more defensive role, he's very good at it. It's just like, so. I mean, I get that, but putting him aside for a second, and Trent's always had a bit of a. It reminds me sometimes of Junior, from the '82 Brazilian team that was just gorgeous fullback to watch because he was always. I mean, it's only his attacking play that you remember. But okay, putting Trent aside. Like it looks psychological, like what's happened to Virgil, what's happened to Fabinho, what's happened to Mo. Like if it wasn't, you could say long COVID, like there's a fogginess, but that lack of intensity is not just physical. It's actually their confidence has been shattered, or and is it something collective, or is there an individual explanation that's different for each of them? I mean. It's a speculative question.
It is a speculative question. On the confidence side, it would be incredible, frankly, if these players, after doing what they have done, not just last year, but over, the past, 4 years, 5 years, that a few setbacks like this could damage their psychology in such a way, that's amazing if that's the case, right? I mean, and it tells you if so, it does tell you a lot about how fragile chemistry and how fragile these things that we take for granted are. That these things are players and squads are vulnerable, and and slight drops in performance. Doesn't have to be much. Slight drops, particularly on the kind of collective level. A 5% drop in performance can mean something quite dramatic in terms of results. I think there's a little bit of transition. I think tactically they're doing some things a little differently. I think they should stick to 4-2, 4-2-3-1 or 4-4-2, whatever we want to call it. I think it probably suits personnel at the moment. I guess we have Arsenal, Rangers away, and City. Maybe we'll have a kind of answer to our questions very soon. But they have to, if they're going to fix things, it kind of has to be now.
Yeah. I mean, there was.
I have a quick question. I know, Tony, you have another question, but I have a quick question. How much does all this stuff matter, given the way that football's changed, like money? So you can be Liverpool, or we can be Liverpool, and we can make this all better again and not feel all dreadful as we start watching a game. I'm already having my what's happening here today, because Man City is just going to buy. They just have pockets full of money, and they're just going to keep buying the best striker like they're doing right now. And Tony's not convinced.
Yeah, I'm not convinced either. I mean, I will say
out of the last couple of Premier Leagues, I mean, they've won most of them, I think, with the one exception that Liverpool won. They've won all the others.
Yeah, but we lost 2 by a point, right? I mean,
right.
And that kind of margin is,
they're like Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg. They're spending so much money, but they win by such a small margin, but they still win.
But I mean, so the reason I'm sort of shaking my head is that what you're not taking account of is how the globalization of the game in particular, and the what's the word, the dissemination of tactical abilities, of coaching levels, etc., means that actually there's a far greater supply of really high quality players all over the world. And you can buy a Haaland, and yes, Haaland is exceptional, and we know that. There's a time, and maybe when he's back to his best, I can imagine Virgil being a difficult defender for him to play against because of his ability to physically actually control the space that a striker is able to move in. But we'll see. I'm not expecting that with the sort of depressed looking Virgil right now. But you can have a team that could buy a Haaland. If certain teams, if they bought a Haaland, wouldn't make a difference. But so you can.
But if you're City, that was what I was going to drive.
Of course, City's an exceptional team.
You're buying Haaland, you have all these other exceptionally good players around Haaland, and it's at some level. I always felt that Liverpool, we were the only team who could and I know you mentioned, Michael, you mentioned the Community Shield, and I was, even though people said, oh, that wasn't competitive, but you always felt Liverpool was the one team, and we know from the previous seasons that could give them a game. It always felt like Liverpool could do it, and now Liverpool, we don't know what's going on with us. So it's that weird feeling that I have that they are just going to dominate. It's not a great feeling. I think nobody's going to celebrate it, but it still sucks.
Oh, it sucks. There's no question about that. I mean, I knew we saw him at Salzburg playing against Liverpool, and he was brilliant then. And even Virgil at that time was very highly complimentary of his performance before he moved to Dortmund. And I knew he was going to be a huge success. I can't imagine. I couldn't have imagined this level of prolific goal scoring. I mean, it's crazy. I'm not sure that he'll be able to keep it up, but the thing that's different about City this year is that if Haaland if he does sustain an injury at some point, if he's out of that squad, that's not a scary squad. They've lost some depth, right? I mean, Sterling is gone, Gabriel Jesus is gone, and those players, they were important players, and Haaland has had his injury issues. So,
and Walker actually also.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, Walker was hurt yesterday. And he's out for, I don't know. I mean, Pep said for some time. So It's October. I'm not gonna freak out. I think it's really it's disappointing that Holland ended up at City. Their ability to they can miss on players. I mean, I think the big difference for Liverpool is they haven't really, right? I mean, the recruiting and the scouting has been really exceptional, but Liverpool doesn't have the margin. I mean, that's the difference that United, City, and Chelsea to an extent, they all can miss. They can spend big and miss, and it's not going to be a disaster. Like Darwin, who I think will work out. I think like the fact that he had 6 shots on target yesterday is super encouraging. I mean, he's really he is chaos in the box, and those shots will start falling eventually. But Liverpool can't miss. City can miss. And it's not the end of the world. But yeah, I mean, it's not fun to watch City do well. That's for sure.
I like the title for this episode, The October Surprise. Something about October. There has to be something about October in this.
Red October.
Red October.
So there's many a Soviet battleship.
You always got to come with the communist references. Red October. Anyway,
Michael, it's been great having you on, and we should do this live during the game.
Oh, that'd be fun.
We could do it during the World Cup. We could definitely do it during the World Cup, which is hopefully
you're on our pundit panel. Yeah.
We want to do some live World Cup streams right after the games or during the games. Anyway, thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, this was wonderful.
Thank you to you both, and good luck to us all this weekend. This is when things begin to turn.
I don't want to have dreadful feelings again.
Inshallah.
Oh God, for these games. Anyway, thank you very much, man.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.